Study Session 3, Cold War, Nuclear Arms Race and Balance of Power. Introduction. The aim of this study session is to put across to you the basic knowledge about the Cold War and the nuclear arms race. We shall also explore how the Cold War gave rise to the emergence of an international organization known today as the Non-Aligned Movement, NAM. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this study session, you should be able to describe the nature of Cold War, discuss the consequences of armed race, highlight the balance of power measures employed by the superpowers, and discuss the emergence of the non-aligned movement. The Cold War. What is meant by the Cold War? The Cold War is the intense economic and political rivalry just short of military confrontation which existed between the USA and the USSR. This Cold War, which began in 1945 after the Second World War, was stimulated by the breakdown of wartime understanding, alliance, agreements, and friendship between the USA and USSR, e.g., the monopoly of nuclear power secrets by the USA, disagreement over the future of Germany, and the fate of European states liberated by the USSR. The Cold War was characterized by the following. A. Hostile propaganda between the USA and USSR. B. Establishment of military bases in many nations by the USA and the USSR. C. Restrictions on movement of ideas and people between both states. D. Restrictions on trade between the USA and the USSR. E. Execution of spy operations against each other. And F. Ideological disputations between socialism and capitalism. What was the reaction of the USA to the Cold War situation? The United States did several things. A. Physical containment actions, such as acquisition of military bases in friendly countries and stationing USA troops there. B. Formation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, in 1949. C. Waging of ideological warfare against the USSR. D. The use of the Marshall Plan, an economic recovery plan involving huge economic aid to keep their friends against the USSR. E. Development of the hydrogen bomb in 1952 and other deadly nuclear weapons for the protection of Western Europe. The USSR did not stand by idly either. Russia took the following actions during the Cold War period. A. She carried out consolidation operations to protect the nations she liberated during the Second World War by giving them economic aid and ensuring that they operate socialist governments. B. The USSR countered the US Marshall Plan by establishing the COMCOM, which is the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance in 1947 for East European states. C. She also established the Warsaw Treaty Organization, WTO, for the defense of socialist states. D. Soviet Union also produced her own atomic bomb in 1949 and went ahead to produce the hydrogen bomb and several nuclear weapon systems. Note: what was the effect of the Cold War on the international system? The Cold War created tension and charged atmosphere in the world. There was a mad rush for military bases by the big powers such as Britain and France. instability and crisis arose. Also, the politics of the international system was seen by the superpowers from only two angles, socialism and capitalism, and the smaller nations were bamboozled into joining one camp or the other. Two very important things that came out of the Cold War were the nuclear arms race and the non-aligned movement. Nuclear arms race. A leading authority in the field, Samuel Huntington, wrote an article in which he defined arms race as a progressive, competitive peacetime increase in armaments by two states or coalition of states resulting from conflicting purposes or mutual fears. He, however, added that not all peacetime increase in arms are necessarily products of arms race, and that there must be a disagreement between two sides as to the proper balance of power between them. Note: it may not be easy to trace the first arms race in the world, but records show that there was a naval race between England and France from 1840 to 1866. Thus, arms race started long ago, but the nuclear dimension of arms race started in 1945 after the Second World War. It started because the USA emerged from the war with an atomic bomb. The USSR, being afraid of this weapon in the hands of its enemies, began to research on its own atomic bomb, which was tested in 1949. The British got their own in 1952, the French in 1960, the Chinese in 1964, India in 1974, and South Africa in 1979. From the atomic bomb, nations went into hydrogen bomb production. Today, these nuclear power nations have hundreds of nuclear weapons, including intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBM, air-to-air missiles, anti-submarine missiles, nuclear torpedoes, and so on. The major nuclear race is between the USA and the USSR, but their accumulation of weapons spill over to other countries, especially those in NATO and the WTO. This race has two types. One is quantitative arms race, which concentrates on weapon stock in terms of numbers, that is, quantity of weapon systems and number of soldiers. And the other is qualitative arms race, which concentrates on innovations or development of new weapon systems. Consequences of arms race. What are the consequences of this arms race? There are four major consequences. 1. Arms race can give rise to war between the two competing nations or bloc of nations. 2. Arms race diverts economic resources from socio-economic activities such as education, health, and agriculture to defense or military needs. 3. Arms race promotes increasing global militarization. 4. It promotes tension around the world. There have been several efforts at controlling arms race, such as the signing of arms control treaties between nations, especially the USA and the USSR, disarmament talks at the United Nations Organization, and anti-armament protests around the world. But these efforts have yielded very little results because 1. There is problem of supervision in enforcing disarmament agreements. 2. Those people who work in arms factories do not want to lose their jobs. 3. There are prestige and security issues as nations measure power and security in terms of types of quantity of weapons they possess. Hint: there have been several efforts at controlling arms race, such as the signing of arms control treaties between nations, especially the USA and USSR, disarmament talks at the United Nations Organization, and anti-armament protests around the world. But these efforts have yielded very little results. These mean that the prospects of controlling arms race are bleak, but all hope is not lost. There is still the fear of mutual destruction between nuclear powers. This fear helps to control their behavior. Also, there are pressures from other nations or nuclear states to stop arms race. The numerous treaties also contribute to controlling arms race, in addition to the United Nations contribution. Finally, we must point out that Africa's major problem with the arms race going on in Europe is that it spills over to Africa, as some states like Ethiopia and Somalia fight each other militarily, while the USA and the USSR only do ideological disputation. Also, the arms race in Africa diverts economic resources away from educational, health, agricultural, and other urgent needs of development to defense. Tip: there are prestige and security issues as nations measure power and security in terms of types of quantity of weapons they possess. Balance of power. Power is the ability to control the actions of others. When a nation A is able to influence and control the behavior of another state B, say that state A has power and its power surpasses that of state B. However, power has many elements, such as economic resources in terms of food and raw materials, political resources such as diplomatic corps, international respect, means military power between the principal potential adversaries, as well as the existence of a system of relations in which excessive ambitions of one or several parties in the balance are contained by the very existence of these more stable relations. From this definition, balance of power is not just when two nations or blocks of nations are at par in terms of their weapon systems. There also have to be ways of checking excesses in the military ambitions of other less powerful nations. You may ask, what is the purpose of this balance of power? Fenelon provided the answer some centuries ago at the close of the reign of Louis XIV. Fenelon had said, to hinder one's neighbor from becoming too strong is not to do harm. It is to guarantee oneself and one's neighbor from subjection. In a word, it is to work for liberty, tranquility, and public safety, because the aggrandizement of one nation beyond a certain limit changes the general system of all nations connected with it. The excessive aggrandizement of one may mean the ruin and subjection of all the other neighbors. This attention to the maintenance of a kind of equality and equilibrium between neighboring states is what assures peace for all. Thus, every nation that wants to be free from subjugation and exploitation must endeavor to have its power balanced with that of other nations. Note: balance of power is not just when two nations or block of nations are at par in terms of their weapon systems. There have to also be ways of checking excesses in the military ambitions of other less powerful nations. Cold War and the Non-Aligned Movement. The Non-Aligned Movement was formed in 1955 as a group of independent nations which have chosen non-alignment as the key philosophy of their foreign policy in relation to the Western capitalist bloc and the Eastern socialist bloc. Non-alignment does not mean that the member nations will not interact or cooperate with the superpowers. It means freedom to decide or choose which side to work with or support in any given situation based on NAM members' interests. This view is strengthened by the expressions of leaders and members of the movement between 1963 and 1977. In 1963, President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana said that non-alignment is based on cooperation with all states, capitalists, socialists, and mixed economy. In 1977, while addressing the United Nations General Assembly on the 13th of October, General Obasanjo of Nigeria said that the vast majority of African and Third World nations have chosen non-alignment as a philosophy in the conduct of their foreign policy. Tip: this non-alignment means that members welcome the friendship and cooperation of all nations on the basis of mutual respect and complete sovereign equality. Emergence of NAM. As discussed earlier, the Cold War was the intense rivalry between the West, led by the USA, and the East, led by the USSR. Both sides were competing for supremacy on all fronts and forcing the smaller nations to join them. Nations that joined the East were punished by the West, and nations that joined the West were punished by the East by denying them economic aid and overthrowing their governments. Thus, most African and Third World nations decided that they don't want to be caught in the rivalry between the USA and the USSR, and therefore opted for non-alignment. That is, they don't align with a particular bloc, either East or West. They want to remain independent. The emergence of NAM began with the meeting in 1954 between some Asian countries' leaders, such as Kotelawa of Sri Lanka, UNU of Burma, Ali of Pakistan, Tito of Yugoslavia, Nehru of India, Sukarno of Indonesia, in Colombo, Sri Lanka. In this meeting, the leaders agreed to meet again in 1955 at Bandung, Indonesia, with African states to form a non-aligned body. It was at this Afro-Asian Bandung Conference of 1955 that the NAM was born. Latin American states later joined. Two outstanding African leaders in the forming of NAM were Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana and President Nasser of Egypt. Hint: most African and Third World nations decided that they don't want to be caught in the rivalry between the USA and the USSR, and therefore opted for non-alignment. That is, they don't align with a particular bloc, either East or West. They want to remain independent. Factors that led to the emergence of NAM. Four major factors that stimulated the emergence of NAM are: 1. The post-World War II Cold War between the USA and the USSR. 2. The establishment of many different military groups or alliances after the Second World War, e.g., NATO in 1949, WTO in 1955. Many Afro-Asian nations saw these bodies as new forces of colonization and refused to join them. 3. The continued existence and effects of colonialism and racism in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. 4. The post-independence neocolonialist manipulations of smaller nations by former colonial masters. Thus, the NAM was formed as a counter-force to protect the small weak nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The members of NAM today are many. They include Nigeria, Ghana, Afghanistan, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Cuba, Turkey, Vietnam, Nepal, Libya, India, Cambodia, China, and so on. As at 1983, NAM had 101 members. To become a member of NAM, 4 main conditions need to be met. 1. Steering clear of the West and East. 2. Having independent foreign policy. 3. Refusing territory to be used for military base for the superpowers. 4. Supporting liberation movements. Any state wishing to join the NAM is required to meet these 4 conditions. Aims and objectives of the NAM. The aims and objectives of the NAM are: 1. To seek world peace and peaceful coexistence. 2. To establish an efficient system of international security against all forms of aggression and threat to the liberty, independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of all states. 3. To promote an end to arms race and achieve general disarmament. 4. To oppose alliances and military pacts with big powers. 5. To oppose the establishment of military bases in nations against their will. 6. To reinforce the ideas and activities of the UNO. 7. To fight colonialism and racism that denies equality and human dignity. And 8. To work for economic independence and cooperation. Since 1955, the NAM has held several conferences to discuss matters affecting members, the movement, and the world in general. Such conferences include the Bandung Conference held in Indonesia in 1955, the Belgrade Conference held in Yugoslavia in 1961, the Cairo Conference held in Egypt in 1964, the Lusaka Conference held in Zambia in 1970, the Algiers Conference held in Algeria in 1973, the Havana Conference held in Cuba in 1979, the New Delhi Conference held in India in 1983. Since the non-aligned movement was formed against the interests of the superpowers, you may want to know what the reactions of the USA and USSR towards the NAM were or are. Of course, they did not take kindly to the formation of NAM, and up till today, the superpowers still work hard to disband the NAM through all sorts of ways and means. NAM was received with hostility and suspicion by both sides. However, since they have not been able to kill NAM, both the USA and USSR try to use NAM to promote their national interests occasionally. E.g., during the Havana Conference of NAM in 1979, the USSR tried to use Cuba to tilt NAM towards socialism but failed. The USA tried to persuade some nations not to attend the Havana meeting. Reflection: they did not take kindly to the formation of NAM, and up till today, the superpowers still work hard to disband the NAM through all sorts of ways and means. NAM was received with hostility and suspicion by both sides. However, since they have not been able to kill NAM, both the USA and USSR try to use NAM to promote their national interests occasionally. Achievements of NAM. 1. The NAM has contributed a lot to the struggle against colonialism and racism in Africa especially, Asia and Latin America. E.g., the first conference at Bandung made a historic declaration to the effect that colonialism was an evil that constituted a stumbling block to the United Nations Organization objectives. 2. The creation of UNCTAD, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, as a UNO body to deliberate on the developmental problems of new states of Africa, Asia, and Latin America was mainly the product of NAM efforts. 3. It has given a lot of support to liberation movements. 4. It has consistently put pressure on the apartheid rulers and their supporters. 5. It has succeeded in building some common factors and objectives in the foreign policy of member states. 6. Its opposition to aggression, arms race, and nuclear testing has served as some degree of check against the political and military recklessness of the big powers. 7. NAM has remained a forum for regional coalition for world politics, as members tend to present a common front at other bodies like the United Nations Organization. 8. The OPEC, that is the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, oil embargo in 1973 against Europe, USA, and Japan, which precipitated an oil crisis that yielded a lot of revenue to oil producers like Nigeria, got stimulus from NAM. Hint: NAM's opposition to aggression, arms race, and nuclear testing has served as some degree of check against the political and military recklessness of the big powers. Challenges facing NAM. Despite all the above, NAM has failed in some aspects of its activities. For example, 1. NAM has not achieved economic independence for its members. 2. NAM has not succeeded in breaking the colonial ties between its members and their former colonial masters. 3. Some members of NAM today have given military bases to the big powers, e.g., Kenya, Morocco, Philippines, Cuba, and so on. 4. NAM has no standing army or any operational military arrangement for protecting its members against external aggression. These failures stem from the problems facing NAM. These problems include: 1. The composition of NAM itself. There are conservative, radical, moderate, and even feudalistic members. This combination creates problems for progress. 2. There is no military arrangement for protecting members. 3. Enforcement of decisions is based on good faith of members. Thus, some members can decide not to carry out NAM's decisions. 4. External interference also disturbs NAM. The East and West try to destabilize, if not liquidate, the movement. 5. Poverty. Many members are very poor. Thus, the budgeting is not rich enough to solve members' problems. 6. Often, the political will to pursue some NAM objectives is absent. The failures and problems of the NAM raise one crucial question, especially when considering the nature and structure of today's international system. And the question is the NAM still relevant today, or has it become an anachronistic organization? The question can be viewed from two angles. Those who argue that NAM is not relevant today say that the world is no more bipolar as it was when NAM was formed, that is, when it was divided into two, the East and the West. Instead, there is polycentrism or polypolar, that is, several centers of power. For example, many countries now have the nuclear weapon, and China has also emerged as a world power. Britain, France, Japan, India, and even South Africa and Pakistan have become powerful nations militarily. They also argue that many members of NAM are aligned to either East or West, e.g., Cuba is attached to the USSR, Kenya is attached to the USA, and so on, and thus the idea of being non-aligned becomes a pretense. Reflection. The failures and problems of the NAM raise one crucial question, especially when considering the nature and structure of today's international system. And the question is the NAM still relevant today, or has it become an anachronistic organization? One can, however, defend NAM by saying that it is still relevant for many reasons. First, the fact that a few members of NAM are attached to the East or West does not condemn the specific direction of the collective will. In general, collective terms, that is, NAM is still non-aligned. Even the Western Newsweek agreed in 1983 that the New Delhi summit really showed non-alignment. It wrote that it seemed fair to say that at least something non-aligned has happened in New Delhi. The New Delhi conference accused both the USA and USSR as some of the industrialized nations owing financial obligations to the developing countries. Second, NAM still supports liberation movements in Africa against colonial and racist forces. Third, NAM has become a policy of solidarity for people struggling against imperialism, oppression, and exploitation. It is a forum for establishing group consensus to back up group expressions in international organizations as the UNO. Fourth, NAM complements the efforts of other international organizations in the search for world peace, security, disarmament, and arms control, as well as friendly relations amongst nations. Fifth, NAM keeps small states out of larger conflicts that do not concern them and helps to avoid alliances that complicate local problems. Activity. Make your PowerPoint presentation on the relevance of NAM in the 21st century. Post your presentation on Study Session 3 forum page on course website. Study Session Summary. In this study session, you learned about Cold War, the nuclear arms race, balance of power, and how non-alignment movement emerged as a result of the Cold War. End of Study Session 3. Thanks for listening.